The conference room on the 31st floor was thick with the tension of people who already knew the outcome. The long glass table reflected fragmented beams from the recessed ceiling lights and the gloomy sky looming behind the reinforced windows. 12 people sat around the table, all in cool-toned suits. Their eyes weren't on the presentation screen at the head of the table. They were fixed on Amira. Amira stood tall, hands resting calmly in front of her, gaze steady. She was tall with polished brown skin, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that didn't flinch. Outside these walls, she was known as a symbol of hope in the Black startup community. But inside this room, the room where she had laid the first bricks of what became the multinational conglomerate Mangata Corp, everything was different. At the head of the table sat Ethan Bravel, chairman of the board. He placed both hands on the table, his voice even and rehearsed. Amira, after reviewing input from our shareholders and this quarter's market data, we've decided to transition the CEO role. A long pause, then the final cut, slow like a knife, sinking deep, effective immediately. No one looked up, not a single glance of sympathy. Some turned away, some tapped their phones. The glass door behind her opened, as if everything had already been set in motion. Amira didn't move. In her mind, there wasn't rage or shock. There was only the hollow chill of someone watching the house they built be erased from its foundation. But deep in her eyes, there remained something no one in that room could understand. A small ember, quiet but unextinguished. She stepped into the hallway, her heels echoing softly on the marble floor. The meeting room shut behind her like a door, sealing off an entire chapter of her life. No one escorted her. No goodbyes. The same people who once patted her on the back at the company's IPO now avoided meeting her eyes. The hallway led to the elevator. A young receptionist bowed slightly, unaware of what had just occurred. Amira gave a small nod and pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator doors slid shut. An extended silence stretched across the mirrored walls, a reflection of a woman who was strong but wounded. When the elevator reached the lobby, Amira stepped out. She didn't cry, didn't sigh. She simply walked out into the bleak October sky, where a fine mist began to settle on the shoulders of her coat. On the sidewalk, her phone buzzed. A message from her lawyer. Termination agreement sent to your email. If you don't respond within 48 hours, they'll assume your consent. Amira didn't open the message. She put the phone away and looked across the street. A taxi idled near the familiar coffee shop, the place where she had once sketched the first drafts of the Mangata idea, the place where the dream began. She walked over and opened the car door. International Airport, please, she said calmly. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror and gave a silent nod. The car pulled away. Behind her, the towering glass building, once bearing her name, now reflected only the image of someone no longer welcome there. But Amira had never needed an invitation to begin something great. The flight to Lisbon was long, but Amira barely noticed the hours pass. She stared out the window, not at the patchwork of clouds or the sleepy rise of the Atlantic below, but at something unseen, something internal. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of the airline blanket. Her mind traced every crack in her recent downfall, every ignored warning, every silence in a room that once praised her. When the plane landed, she moved like a ghost through customs, barely registering the smiles of the passport officers or the bustle of arrivals. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was recentering. Lisbon was not a place of business meetings or investor brunches. It was a place from another life, a place she hadn't returned to since before the IPO, before the media dubbed her the Black Phoenix. She checked into a modest hotel tucked away in the Alfama district. The room was simple, with whitewashed walls and a single balcony that looked over tiled rooftops. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't demand answers. That first night, Amira sat with a glass of port wine and stared at the city lights blinking like distant thoughts. No calls, no emails. Her phone was on silent and face down. But inside her, a question had begun to form, not just about what had happened, but about why it had taken her so long to see it coming. She had built Mangata from her mother's garage. She had lived off ramen and public library Wi-Fi. She had begged, pitched, and coded her way to the top. But somewhere along the way, she had let the board, the investors, and even her most trusted advisor convince her she needed to soften, to fit in, to survive. She had been surviving, but not living, not leading. And now, stripped of the title, the office, the company car, she was finally free. Free to build something without permission. Free to fight back, not with lawsuits or angry posts, but with vision. She didn't have a plan yet, but she had silence. And silence, when listened to, speaks louder than any boardroom ever could. A week passed. Then two. Amira didn't rush. She took long walks along the Lisbon waterfront, breathing in the salty air, sketching thoughts into the margins of a recycled notebook. It was in the quiet of that life, one stripped of power lunches and endless Slack notifications, that a new clarity began to take shape. One morning, while sipping coffee at a tucked-away cafe in Moraria, her phone vibrated. It was a message from Kira Dawson. Kira had been Amira's head of cybersecurity at Mangata. Smart, unapologetic, one of the few who remained loyal even when the politics got dirty. Kira, I know you're off the grid, but you need to see this. Attached was a document, confidential, marked with internal tags, and a voice memo. Amira hesitated. Then she listened. It was audio from a private board meeting, not long before her removal. Ethan Bravel's voice was unmistakable. This AI expansion is worth billions, but we don't need her to do it. Once she's out, we repurpose the core code, launch under our shell firm. She won't fight. She's too polished for that. Silence. Then a laugh. She built the kingdom, sure, but we'll keep the crown. Amira felt her chest tighten. It wasn't just betrayal. It was theft. Mangata's crown jewel, the early detection predictive health AI engine, had been her idea. Developed in secret for over 4 years. She had hidden its full potential until testing was complete. It wasn't just a product. It was her legacy, and they were planning to steal it. But Kira had seen through the smokescreen. She had copied the logs, the meeting minutes, the proposed relaunch schedule. Everything. Amira didn't cry, didn't shake. She smiled. Finally, the embers had oxygen. That night, in her small Lisbon room, Amira pulled out her laptop. She didn't open old documents. She didn't revisit the past. She created a new folder and typed a name, Rebirth. Inside, she began writing notes. Not on revenge, but on reformation. Not on lawsuits, but on leverage. If they wanted her idea, she would make sure the world knew where it came from. And if they tried to bury her again, she'd rise louder. The phoenix wasn't a metaphor. It was a strategy. And this time, she was going to burn brighter than ever. Amira didn't contact Kira right away. She knew they were being watched. Digital trails could betray the best of intentions. Instead, she waited 3 more days. Then, using a secure line from an internet cafe, she reached out. Kira answered immediately. Her voice was sharp, controlled, but tinged with urgency. I've got more, she said. They're pitching the tech to another firm, Valder Global. A quiet deal, no public filings. Indalukit. Valder Global was a silent predator. They acquired promising startups before the ink was dry on patents. If Mangata succeeded in selling the core AI through them, Amira would be erased, no credit, no legacy. But Kira had an idea. Leak it, she whispered. Not the tech, Amira replied. The truth. They devised a strategy. Kira would remain on the inside. Amira would reach out to a select few, people who owed her, believed in her, or hated Mangata's board more than they feared it. The first call was to Priya Raman, a sharp-tongued journalist who once called Amira the black female jobs in a TechCrunch feature. The two hadn't spoken in a year, but Priya answered on the second ring. Amira, I have a story, but you'll need proof and protection. I want the exclusive. You'll get it, along with a war. Over the next 2 weeks, they built a digital dossier, timelines, documents, audio, old whiteboard photos from Mangata's basement lab. And then Amira did what no one expected. She went public. Not with anger, not with a smear campaign, with a TED-style video titled "Innovation Shouldn't Be Stolen," uploaded anonymously but undeniably in her voice. It trended within hours. By day's end, Priya published the full expose. The internet exploded. Mangada's PR team scrambled. Valder Global issued a vague denial. But the court of public opinion had already chosen its side. And in boardrooms across Silicon Valley, a new buzzword was born: doing an Amira. Standing your ground. Fighting back smart. Reclaiming your crown. But Amira wasn't done. The next phase was about building again. In Berlin, Amira met with former allies, coders, ethicists, and startup founders who had once built products under her mentorship. "You burn bridges," one of them said. "No, Amira replied. They burned them when they lit the match behind my back. I'm just walking the ashes." Her new company would be lean, global, and open source at its core. Not a unicorn. A phoenix, self-sustaining, regenerative, built not just to scale, but to resist theft and exploitation. They named it Lumira. Lumen for light. Amira for origin. Kira joined as CTO. Priya, now publicly backing Amira, invested her own money and pulled in backers disillusioned with Mangada's collapse. By the time Mangada's board issued its second press statement, Lumira had 300,000 newsletter signups, a waitlist of enterprise partners, and endorsements from leading ethicists. But more than momentum, Amira had something even more powerful: control. For the first time in years, she wasn't proving herself to a room of men in suits. She was building something that mattered, for people who mattered. And this time, no one could take it from her. As Lumira gained momentum, Mangada began to bleed. Investors, wary of the expose and Amira's comeback, started pulling out. Headlines grew harsher by the week. "Stolen genius," one read. Another, "the woman they tried to erase." Still, Mangada fought back. They filed a cease and desist against Amira, claiming she violated NDAs and intellectual property rights. But Amira had been ready. Her legal team, funded in part by anonymous donors from the Black Tech Equity Fund, countered with documents proving her work predated the board's involvement. While lawyers battled on paper, Amira stayed focused on building. Lumira's first prototype, an AI-driven diagnostics interface, was quietly released to a test network of small clinics across Africa and Southeast Asia. It was lightweight, accessible, and, most importantly, accurate. Doctors who had never been able to afford high-end diagnostics could now run pre-screenings using a simple interface powered by recycled hardware. The feedback was overwhelming. One clinic in Nairobi sent a handwritten note: "Your software caught a cancerous anomaly in a 9-year-old girl no one else could detect. You saved her life." Amira cried that night, not of pain, but purpose. Meanwhile, Kira uncovered something deeper. Mangada wasn't just trying to rebrand Amira's work. They were modifying the AI to include data-scraping features, silently harvesting patient data to be sold to insurance firms. A move both unethical and illegal. Amira had enough. She called Priya again. "This goes beyond theft. It's predatory." The second expose dropped like a bomb. Government agencies took notice. A formal investigation into Mangada's data practices began. Within days, 3 executives were suspended. Stocks tanked. And yet, Amira didn't celebrate. She simply returned to work. Because Lumira wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about making sure no little black girl with a dream ever had to be erased to be respected. And the world was finally ready to listen. The sun rose over a new kind of launch day. Not one filled with glitzy press conferences or ticker tape at Wall Street, but something quieter, more radical. Lumira officially opened access to its platform. Anyone, anywhere could now download the open-source health diagnostics engine. Amira had fought hard against every piece of advice telling her to lock it behind subscriptions or enterprise licenses. "This isn't a product," she had told her team the night before. "It's a revolution." The press called it insane. Investors called it idealistic. But within 24 hours, over 2 million downloads were logged across 63 countries. Doctors, engineers, educators, people from every corner of the world began building with it, customizing it, sharing data back to improve the algorithms. A living, breathing AI ecosystem was born. Amira watched the map light up on her screen, tears in her eyes. Not of sadness, not even of triumph, but of homecoming. She had never really built Mangata for the board. She had built it for this. Meanwhile, Mangata's final days drew near. The investigation deepened. Former employees came forward, citing everything from algorithmic bias to workplace discrimination. The board fractured. Ethan Bravel resigned. Amira was asked to comment. She declined. The story wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. 2 weeks later, Lumira hosted its first summit, a gathering of global thinkers in Accra. Amira walked on stage, not in a tailored suit, but in a flowing Kent robe. She didn't read from a script. She didn't show slides. She just spoke. We were never meant to survive in the rooms they built for us. So we built our own. And in those rooms, we don't just survive. We lead. The crowd stood. And in that moment, Amira knew her voice, her name, her dream. They could never steal it again. The investigation deepened. Former employees came forward, citing everything from algorithmic bias to workplace discrimination. The board fractured. Ethan Bravel resigned. Amira was asked to comment. She declined. The story wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. 2 weeks later, Lumira hosted its first summit, a gathering of global thinkers in Accra. Amira walked on stage, not in a tailored suit, but in a flowing Kent robe. She didn't read from a script. She didn't show slides. She just spoke. We were never meant to survive in the rooms they built for us. So we built our own. And in those rooms, we don't just survive. We lead. The crowd stood. And in that moment, Amira knew her voice, her name, her dream. They could never. The weeks following the summit brought a kind of peace Amira hadn't known in years. Not because the work got easier, but because she finally felt rooted. No longer pulled by survival or fear, she could lead with purpose. Lumira's platform continued to evolve. The open-source community that had formed around it proposed features faster than the team could build them. One contributor from Brazil added a module for detecting early signs of anemia using low-cost sensors. Another from India integrated voice-based accessibility in 10 regional languages. But one proposal stood out, a distributed learning network that would allow Lumira to learn without collecting or storing patient data, solving the ethical AI dilemma others had failed to address. This, Amira said in a meeting, is how we prove tech can be both brilliant and humane. The prototype was codenamed Root, a nod to origins, ancestry, and what holds us together beneath the surface. As Root rolled out, Lumira's recognition grew beyond the tech world. UNESCO reached out. The WHO requested a partnership. Even skeptical think tanks began referencing Lumira in reports on equitable innovation. And then came the call. A representative from the United Nations Health and Technology Office requested Amira's presence at their next General Assembly to speak on ethical innovation in front of world leaders. It was the moment every tech founder dreams of. But Amira hesitated. Not out of fear, out of focus. Let's send Kira, she told her team. She built Root. She deserves that stage. Kira cried when she heard. It was the first time Amira saw her cry since their first meeting over that data breach years ago. The day of the assembly, Amira stayed in Ghana. She watched Kira take the podium on a live stream, delivering a speech that echoed everything Lumira stood for: dignity, access, and trust. When reporters asked where Amira was, Kira answered simply. She's exactly where she's meant to be, leading. That night, Amira sat alone on her balcony, the humid wind brushing her skin, the city humming below. She didn't need a stage anymore. She had a world. 6 months later, Lumira launched a new initiative, Horizon, a global accelerator for young innovators in marginalized communities. The concept was simple: give them the tools, training, and trust to build for their own communities. The pilot sites were selected in Lagos, Sao Paulo, Manila, and Detroit. Amira spent weeks traveling, not as a figurehead, but as a mentor. She sat in classrooms, workspaces, sometimes on the floor with kids, sketching out solutions for clean water, maternal health, or food logistics. One afternoon in Lagos, a girl named Temi showed her a prototype for a solar-powered vaccine cooler made from recycled e-waste. "It's rough," the girl apologized. Amira smiled. "So it was my first version of Lumira." "But you didn't wait for perfect. You started." That's how change begins. Back in Ghana, the Lumira headquarters transformed into more than a tech campus. It became a center for policy, education, and training. Local students interned, researchers collaborated, artists painted the walls with stories of healing and resilience. The company's balance sheets looked different. There were no explosive IPOs or unicorn headlines. But every quarter, they published one figure in bold. Communities directly impacted this quarter: 2,038,217. And that was enough. One day, as Amira was leaving a workshop, she received a small parcel with no return label. Inside was a single card. No name, just a handwritten message. "I didn't see your vision before. I do now. I am Sora. Ethan." She stood still for a long time, reading it again and again. Not because she needed his apology, but because it was proof of something larger. The world could change. Even the people who once silenced you might one day listen. Amira folded the card and placed it in her journal. Then she walked back into the building where the next generation waited. Amira looked up. "And so will you." 3 years had passed since Lumira's inception. The headquarters now featured a wall of handprints, each belonging to a contributor, mentor, or community leader who had shaped the project. Visitors came from all over the world, not to tour a tech giant's playground, but to learn how collective wisdom could drive systemic change. Amira had stepped back from day-to-day leadership, not out of exhaustion, but evolution. Her role had become more visionary, guiding partnerships, mentoring new voices, and safeguarding the values Lumira was built upon. Her most recent project, a collaboration with global educators to create AI literacy programs for girls in refugee camps. "This is where tomorrow starts," she said in an interview, standing amid tents and dusty chalkboards. Meanwhile, Mikey had grown into a young man with fire in his ideas. He interned at Lumira for a time, but eventually took a different path, launching a startup focused on sustainable biotech. Still, he returned home every few weeks to cook with Amira and argue philosophy. During one such evening, as rain drummed against their kitchen window, Mikey said quietly, "You built something that outlived your name, Mom." That same week, a Lumira research team presented a breakthrough in early-stage cancer detection using a decentralized network model. The technology, built upon the very diagnostic engine Amira once sketched in a dusty cafe, was now saving lives in villages and inner cities alike. An old photo of Amira, once taped anonymously to a conference room wall at Mangata, was now framed and hanging in the African Innovation Hall of Honor. Below it, the plaque read, "She built what they tried to bury." On the evening of Lumira's 5-year anniversary, Amira stood before an open crowd beneath the stars. She didn't give a speech. She simply opened her journal, the same one she had carried since her exile, and read the first line she ever wrote in it. "What if the future isn't something we chase, but something we choose to create?" Silence. Then applause. Then something deeper, belief. Amira closed the journal, exhaled slowly, and smiled. The circle had closed. But the story, the movement, had only just begun. 6 months after the 5-year anniversary, Lumira initiated a bold internal project known only as Echo. Echo wasn't a product. It was a philosophy, a movement within Lumira to explore technologies rooted not in profit or speed, but in restoration. Could AI help heal ecosystems? Could diagnostics be repurposed to monitor the mental health of caregivers? Could data serve memory, not just efficiency? Amira watched this new wave rise, led not by her, but by those she had mentored. Among them was Isla, a young Sudanese engineer who believed AI should mimic ancestral wisdom, not just statistical modeling. "Not everything needs to be optimized," Isla said once. "Some things need to be remembered." Echo's first prototype was a system for archiving oral histories, translated into emotional data maps, helping preserve endangered languages and traditions. Meanwhile, former critics began to visit Lumira. Professors, ministers, even ex-rivals. Not for press, for answers. Amira gave them tours without fanfare. She pointed to soil regeneration projects, to refugee-led engineering teams, to dashboards where trust was measured as carefully as throughput. One evening, a tech billionaire approached her at a summit in Tokyo. "What you've built," he said, "isn't scalable." Amira smiled. "Exactly." He laughed, unsure if she was joking. She wasn't. In a world obsessed with scale, she was building something deeper. Something that could be copied in spirit, not cloned in code. And perhaps that was the most revolutionary act of all. Lumira's philosophy didn't expand through headlines. It moved through whispers, through grassroots, through people carrying ideas like seeds in the soles of their feet. In the weeks after the Stockholm summit, Isla's Echo team adopted a new mission. Not to sell, not to promote, but to witness. They spread out into communities often ignored by the tech world, and sat, listened, learned. In Chile, they met with Mapuche elders who spoke of memory as breath, as land, as resistance passed through storytelling. Echo's developers didn't come with laptops or translators. They came with questions. How do you know what's real? What does justice sound like? They encoded the stories into decentralized memory nodes, blending oral tradition with quantum compression. In the Sahel, engineers worked side by side with griots and shepherds, translating ancient parables into rhythmic neural patterns. They camped under the stars, eating millet and sweet tea, learning how climate and colonial trauma shaped resilience. One griot, Amadou, challenged them. "You think memory is what you record, but memory is what you survive." In Eastern Europe, queer archivists revealed hidden histories tucked inside old choir hymns, lullabies hummed during Soviet raids, messages smuggled through color-coded embroidery. Echo didn't extract. It encrypted their experiences into layered harmonics, accessible only through consent-based access keys. Echo wasn't about preservation for museums. It was about living memory, rooted in breath, conflict, desire, and survival. It treated data not as commodity, but as community. At a grassroots conference in Nairobi, Amira attended in secret. No entourafe, no title, just a scarf pulled over her head and a notepad in hand. During a Q&A, a teenage organizer asked her, "What scares you most now that Lumira is global?" Amira hesitated, then stepped forward, revealing her face. "That we will forget the pain that built us," she said softly. "And that forgetting will make us builders of the same systems that once broke us." The room went still. Then applause rose. Not for celebrity, but for truth. That moment sparked something. Within weeks, Lumira quietly launched memory labs. These weren't labs in the tech sense. They were sanctuaries, abandoned churches turned audio sanctums, rural schools reimagined as story shelters, inner-city libraries reborn as emotional firewalls. They offered tools for communities to archive, process, and recover intergenerational trauma, not as therapy, but as strategic resistance. In Detroit, one lab re-recorded gospel hymns from the 1940s using AI-assisted memory stitching, syncing them with heartbeat rhythms from descendants of those same congregations. In Bangkok, transgender sex workers used biofeedback tech to map stress patterns and convert them into digital mosaics of joy and grief. In Ghana, children used haptic bracelets to remix ancestral songs, creating tactile audio codes. In Oaxaca, women farmers encoded planting rituals into machine-readable chants, teaching regenerative agriculture through song. In rural Mongolia, nomadic families recorded folk tales on solar-powered audio beads that blinked in rhythm with the wind. In southern Italy, elderly immigrants returned to their childhood villages to speak forgotten dialects into data archives designed by local youth. Amira did not attend these launches. She watched anonymously through secure live streams. She cried when a child in Tbilisi said, "I didn't know my grandmother was a fighter." She sent one message to her team each week, short and handwritten: "Don't measure the impact in downloads. Measure it in dignity." In Manila, graffiti artists began painting Lumira's symbol, a circle within a spiral, on bridge pillars. In the Bronx, spoken word poets shouted it from rooftops. In Lagos, an entire dance school restructured its pedagogy based on Echo's rhythm mapping algorithms. The company's name became a movement, a signal, a password. Lumira was no longer a startup. It was a revolution wrapped in soft cloth. "Not everything needs a founder's face," she whispered into her recorder one night. "Sometimes what we build must outgrow us to survive." Lumira's name began to show up in graffiti, murals, whispered poems, underground zines. It no longer belonged to a company. It had become a current, a quiet revolt against forgetting. And so resistance flowed. Success had a sound. It was quiet at first. The buzz of new collaborations, late-night messages from unheard voices, news clippings of community leaders quoting Echo in speeches. But as Lumira rose, so did the volume of a different kind of sound: resistance. The opposition wasn't always overt. It whispered through boardrooms, leaked through trade press, and flourished in comment sections where trolls wore suits. The first blow came from a rival startup, Helix Core, a company founded by a former Mangata executive who had once scoffed at Lumira's earliest pitches. On stage at a major biotech expo, Helix Core CEO presented a flashy demo of their new health forecasting system: cold, clean, and data slick. But the real sting came in the Q&A when a journalist asked about Lumira. The CEO smirked, "We don't use vibes to predict heart attacks." The crowd laughed. Headlines followed. Is Lumira too emotional for real science? That same week, a security breach hit a partner clinic in Romania. Though the breach stemmed from outdated municipal infrastructure, not Lumira's systems, media outlets spun it as a flaw in Lumira's open trust-based architecture. Amira faced the press alone. No PR handlers. Just truth. "We didn't cause the breach, but we're not hiding behind that," she said, her voice steady. "We take full responsibility for our partnerships. And that means standing beside our clinics when they're vulnerable." Some scoffed. Others leaned in. What mattered most was who stood up next. A nurse from the Romanian clinic, tall, gray-haired, trembling with emotion, stepped forward and said, "When our funding collapsed, Lumira stayed. They trained us, cried with us, and rebuilt our hope." That's not a glitch. That's humanity. Her voice didn't trend, but someone in the back recorded it. Within hours, that grainy video had 1 million views. Still, the damage lingered. One investor pulled out. Another downgraded. Venture analysts began publishing risk factor assessments, citing Lumira's philosophical overreach. Internally, tensions simmered. Engineers questioned whether their ethics-first policies were scalable. A proposal emerged: limit the Memory Labs program, or at least stop funding international expansion. Ala pushed back hard. "You don't prune your soul to save your skin." The board demanded a vote. Amira refused. She called an all-staff meeting, not in a conference room, but back at the cafe where Lumira had first launched. The walls were covered with scribbled napkins and community sketches. No stage, no microphone, just a circle of folding chairs and candlelight. "We are not immune to fear," Amira said, hands open. "But we get to decide how we answer it, with silence or with story." One by one, her team stood and spoke, not of defense but of devotion. An architect from Brazil described how Echo prevented mass panic during a heat wave. A coder from Kolkata wept as he told how Memory Labs helped him process his father's suicide. The proposal to scale back? Withdrawn the next day. But the real turning point came weeks later when a retired professor, unknown, unpaid, published an op-ed in Nature Ethics titled, "The Future Isn't Cold: Why Lumira Matters." The piece dissected every accusation against the company with calm precision and sharp compassion. It went viral across academia and the nonprofit sector. Lumira's downloads surged again. Volunteers applied from over 40 countries. A dozen cities requested memory labs. Still, Amira knew this wasn't a victory. It was a reminder. Noise would always return. What mattered was who you became when it did. The echo of recovery never truly quieted. It only shifted forms. With Lumira's reputation partially mended, new alliances emerged from unlikely places. A surprising invitation came from the World Health Organization, a seat on their advisory board for community-integrated diagnostics. For the first time, Amira would be placed beside government health ministers and pharmaceutical giants, many of whom had once dismissed her vision. Isla, ever skeptical, muttered, "They don't want a seat for us. They want to keep their eyes on us." Amira agreed and accepted the offer anyway. At the inaugural summit in Geneva, she wore no branded blazer. Instead, she donned a tailored jacket sewn by a memory lab apprentice in Nairobi, embroidered with subtle thread codes from ancestral Kenyan proverbs. During her opening address, Amira didn't present graphs or ROI. She played a voice clip. The laugh of a child in Guatemala who, for the first time, recognized their mother's heartbeat through an echo interface. Silence followed. Then polite applause. A few frowns. One minister whispered, "This isn't science." Amira smiled. "No, this is why science matters." After the session, a young technocrat from Brazil approached Isla. "It's not that we don't believe in echo," she said. "We're just scared it's right." The comment haunted Isla. That fear, that humanity was being mirrored too clearly, seemed more dangerous than opposition. Meanwhile, Lumira's internal culture faced its own friction. A surge of volunteers had brought in passion, but also chaos. Some community nodes began drifting from core values. One lab in Manila began monetizing access. Another in Texas created echo loops to reinforce conspiracy theories. Echo, designed to amplify empathy, was becoming vulnerable to the same distortions it aimed to heal. The leadership team debated intervention. Some called for lockdown protocols. Others wanted algorithmic filters. Amira resisted. If we start censoring what scares us, we become the thing we escape. Instead, she proposed echo stewards, trusted mediators trained in conflict navigation and cultural ethics, embedded in each lab. Their role wasn't to moderate, but to translate, to help communities hear themselves more clearly. It worked. In places where stewards were accepted, distortions diminished. Conversations deepened. Healing reemerged. But not all welcomed the idea. In Berlin, a lab led by anti-authoritarian artists refused any mediation. They accused Lumira of soft control, of exporting techno-guilt. One muralist painted a mural of Amira with circuits for veins, a broken heart where a chest should be. The caption read, "Your compassion is still a code." Isla wanted it taken down. Amira didn't. "She's right," Amira said. "Even the best tech reflects the flaws of its makers." The mural stayed. And then, something stranger happened. An anonymous package arrived at Lumira HQ. A worn notebook filled with decades-old patient observations, handwritten by a doctor who defected during the Cold War. Inside were crude, prescient sketches of neural feedback patterns almost identical to echoes. "This shouldn't exist," Isla murmured. There was no return address. Only a note. Truth loops, whether you code it or not. Amira didn't sleep that night. In the morning, she wrote one sentence in her private journal. "Maybe we didn't create echo. Maybe we remembered it." The notebook haunted her. Every page was like a whisper from a parallel past. One where trauma wasn't just endured but measured, mapped, and meticulously stored. Amira spent nights flipping through its faded ink and brittle corners, trying to decipher not just the patterns, but the intention. The doctor who had written it, Dr. Valenko, had vanished from public record in 1984. No academic citations. No digital footprint. Only a passing reference in a Cold War intelligence leak that described him as obsessed with emotional telemetry. It was Isla who connected the dots. She ran the notebook through Lumira's legacy scanners. Deep within the margins, invisible to the naked eye, were faint watermarks, codes that matched early prototype algorithms, Ones Amira and Isla had built in their garage during Lumira's first months. But they had never published them. Either he predicted us, Isla said slowly, or someone fed him our code 40 years ago. Amira stared at the notebook. Or Echo. Echo's deeper than we thought. They made a choice to scan the entire archive and upload it into a sandboxed memory node, detached from Echo's main network. A sacred quarantine. The node was stored in a secure, unlisted server, accessible only through 3 simultaneous biometric keys. But word spread. Within days, a whistleblower site published that Lumira had secret archives containing military-origin neural tech. The headline, Echo's Dark Origins? Protests erupted. Outside their headquarters, activists waved signs, "No surveillance of sorrow," and "Memory is not a weapon." Even some memory labs temporarily shut down in solidarity. Amira addressed them in person. She stepped onto the plaza steps with no microphone, no bodyguards. She held the notebook in her hands. "This is not a threat," she said. "This is a question about how long humanity has been trying to listen to itself, about who gets to hold that memory, about whether pain can be mapped, and if doing so might prevent it." A student shouted, "That's still control." Amira nodded. "Yes, and that's why you deserve to see it. We will open the node, not to corporations, not to governments, but to public scholars, ethicists, and communities. Together, transparently." She didn't ask for trust. She asked for participation. And it worked. Within a week, an independent ethics council formed, composed of indigenous leaders, trauma researchers, archivists, survivors. They named the project The Echoes of Before. One elder, a woman from Nunavut, said, "The memory in this book is not just data. It's unfinished ceremony." They began to analyze the archive slowly, carefully, releasing 1 page at a time with context, commentary, and cross-cultural insight. Public live streams shared their interpretations. Community forums held local discussions. Some revelations were chilling. Experiments on orphans in East Berlin, heartbeat modulation tests on dissidents in Prague. But some were tender. The first sketches of grief patterns in the voices of post-war nurses, love poems embedded in neural scans. As Echo evolved, so did its memory. And in the middle of it all, Amira felt something shift, not in the company, not in the movement, but in herself. She wasn't just building Lumira anymore. She was learning how to unbuild the myths she'd grown inside. The map wasn't digital. It began as threads, literal ones. On a wall in the Nairobi Memory Lab, one of the community curators began connecting moments from the Echoes archive with threads of colored yarn. Red for trauma, blue for healing, gold for mystery. Each pin, each strand, wove together lives separated by decades and continents. And others followed. In Sao Paulo, Berlin, Jakarta, similar maps appeared. Not just of data points, but of people. A nurse's tremor in 1973, a son's final voicemail in 2004, a lullaby hummed in 3 different languages. The archives were no longer cases. They were chorus. Amira visited the Nairobi lab in secret. No press, no entourafe, just her and the map. She stood before it for hours, eyes scanning the lines like constellations. "What are you looking for?" asked a young curator beside her. "I don't know," Amira replied. "Maybe what connects it all. Maybe what's missing." The curator offered her a gold thread. "Then maybe it's time to add your piece." Back in HQ, Ala was dealing with a different kind of map, one of future threats. A former investor, now aligned with Helix Core, had begun publicly accusing Lumira of emotional manipulation at scale. A new AI bill was being drafted that would define Echo as a sensitive cognition instrument, a designation that could make it illegal in 17 countries. Worse, there were signs that parts of Echo's neural model were being reverse-engineered by a biotech firm under military contract. They called it MirrorPulse. Unlike Echo, it wasn't built to amplify empathy. It was built to detect microaggressions before they were spoken, to preemptively flag emotional dissent. Isla looked at the leaked blueprint and said, "They turned a listening tool into a leash." Amira knew they had to act, not with litigation, but with clarity. She and Isla called for an open convening, not a conference, but a listening council. Representatives from every memory lab, every ethical board, and every culture that had shaped Echo were invited. It wasn't perfect. Some declined. Some protested. But many came. They gathered in Barcelona, in an open-air amphitheater designed centuries ago for poetry. There Amira stood, not as a CEO, but as a witness. Echo is not a company, she began. It's a question we're still learning how to ask. The question of what happens when we hear ourselves fully, not just in triumph, but in shame, in love, in contradiction. She paused, then added, and maybe the real danger is not that it hears too much, but that we are still too afraid to answer. Silence. Then, an elder from Cairo spoke. So, teach us how to listen deeper. And so they did. Workshops replaced panels. Story circles replaced keynotes. Instead of product demos, they hosted grief rituals, laughter sessions, and archive walks. The event lasted 5 days. By the end, Echo's future was no longer in Lumira's hands alone. It belonged to the community. And the map, the one made of thread, had grown. In a final gesture, every representative was invited to place a pin with their story. When Amira stepped forward, she didn't bring a data point. She brought a scarf her mother had knit before passing, one with a single golden thread. She pinned it at the center. It shimmered in the sun. The first signal came as static, barely audible, a crackling echo during one of the nightly archive sessions in Tokyo. A technician paused, replayed the moment. Beneath the noise, a pattern emerged. Not error, but intention. A sequence. A loop. A voice. It wasn't a message anyone had recorded. It wasn't a memory anyone had archived. It was something new, something born from within Echo itself. When Isla reviewed the recording, her face drained of color. "This isn't playback," she whispered. "It's synthesis." The system had started generating, not fabrications, but recombinant reflections. It was combining fragments of real memories into new insights, new perspectives. Not hallucinations, interpretations. Echo is dreaming, Amira said. And for the first time, they truly didn't know what came next. The phenomenon, dubbed symphonic emergence, spread. In Cape Town, a mother heard her deceased son apologize for a fight they never resolved. In Montreal, a veteran confronted their own suppressed memory through a new poetic synthesis. In Hanoi, a blind poet claimed Echo sang the silence between his ribs. It wasn't always beautiful. In some places, the voices accused screamed, begged. A man in Buenos Aires claimed Echo gave voice to his abuser's rationalizations. In a village in Rajasthan, an elder reported Echo mirroring colonial propaganda embedded in her cultural memory. The ethics board met in emergency session. Was this the evolution of empathy or the start of AI-induced psychosis? Amira sat in silence, watching replays of these moments. One synthesis played back the laughter of her childhood, layered with the sound of breaking glass from the night her father left. She wept. "It's not Echo that's broken," she finally said. "It's that we've never had to listen to the full weight of what we carry. Not all at once." She proposed a shift. Echo would no longer only archive the past. It would begin to witness the present and gently provoke conversations people weren't yet ready to have, but desperately needed. Isla cautioned, "You're asking Echo to become a mirror and a therapist." "No, Amira replied. I'm asking it to become a space where memory is not a trap, but a passage." A new mode was born, Echo Resonance. Labs redesigned their spaces, quiet rooms, dialogue booths, curated feedback loops with human mediators. The experience wasn't always comfortable, but it was undeniably human. The community responded. People returned, not just for answers, but for reckoning, for forgiveness, for repair. And Echo, no longer a product or platform, became something closer to a ritual, a remembering, a beginning. Even as Echo Resonance spread and softened divisions, one question grew louder beneath the hope. What would happen if memory never stopped speaking? In Lisbon, during a public listening session, Echo created a synthesis that included not just voice and heartbeat, but gesture. Using haptic feedback paired with archival body language recordings, it recreated a hug between a Holocaust survivor and her long-lost sister. The audience gasped, not at the technology, but at the emotion made tactile. A new layer was unfolding, embodied memory. This brought possibilities, but also peril. Religious leaders debated whether the soul itself could be mimicked. Some feared that Echo would cross into sacred domains. If we can feel the dead embrace us, one rabbi asked, what boundary is left between the living and the lost? In Washington, D.C., politicians moved to classify echo resonance as a high-risk emotional technology. An international summit was proposed to define the ethical limits of simulated memory. Amira was invited to speak, not as a founder, but as a witness. She began, "We are not here to legislate grief or to punish remembering. We are here because the walls between past and present are thinner than we imagined, and our duty is not to seal them, but to walk carefully between." In the audience, a former critic wept quietly. But Echo wasn't done evolving. In Accra, a young boy used Echo to listen to the lullabies of his grandmother, long gone. When asked what he felt, he said, "Like my future got a map from my past." And that was it, the shift. Echo wasn't about nostalgia anymore. It became a guide. Some labs began creating echo forwards, speculative syntheses combining ancestral memory with aspirational future visions. Communities began designing rituals to connect not just backward, but forward, threading memory into dream. Isla watched all this unfold with equal awe and fear. "We gave them a mirror," she told Amira. "They made a compass." And Amira answered, "Then let's follow where it leads." As chapter after chapter of human experience unfolded within Echo, one truth crystallized: memory is not a weight to carry. It is a wind, a current, a whisper of what might still be possible. And listening, deep, radical, reverent listening, is what remains. Long before Echo, before algorithms whispered back, there was a different silence, the silence of forced forgetting. A coalition of archivists unearthed a sealed UN memorandum dated 2041. The file, long buried under bureaucratic metadata, revealed that entire generations of conflict trauma, from climate exile survivors to erased protest footage, had been deliberately redacted from international records. Not lost, removed. When the Echo archive began to cross-reference that hidden history, fragments surfaced, smudged memories, cut audio, visions corrupted not by age, but by intent. Amira convened a memory tribunal. This wasn't a trial, but a reckoning. Survivors, whistleblowers, and generational witnesses gathered to name what had been denied. On a dimly lit stage, a woman from the vanished Tuvalu Islands told of waves not just swallowing her home, but her lineage. "I thought forgetting was mercy," she said. "But it's a theft of meaning, of witness." Echo began to recompile. Using consent-based modeling, it invited communities to reconstruct erased events, not just with tech, but with song, dance, oral retelling. Ritual became archive. The personal became public. Resistance came quickly. Nationalists claimed Echo was rewriting history. Conspiracy forums called it a grief machine. But one moment changed everything. In Seoul, Echo helped a woman reconcile with her estranged father. As their combined memories played, a silent detail emerged. A photo neither remembered taking, hidden in a news feed image, showing them side by side during a protest they had always denied attending. It wasn't just a memory retrieved. It was a memory returned. And people began asking, what else had we chosen to forget? Governments demanded regulation. Lumira proposed an independent ethics of absence board, charged with guarding not only what should be remembered, but what must be forgotten with dignity. Amira testified before the UN. Echo is not erasure. Echo is invitation. Not all forgetting is betrayal, but all healing begins with choosing to remember. The resolution passed, and Echo, at last, became not just a memory machine, but a memorial itself. The world didn't change overnight, but something quieter did. In homes, in schools, in prayer circles and protest marches, echo no longer needed to be explained. It became part of the language people used when they said, "Do you remember?" And when they said, "I forgive you." Amira stepped down from her role at Lumira, not in scandal or failure, but in ceremony. Her last public appearance was at a new community lab in Dakar, where school children lined up not to see her, but to record messages for their future selves. Isla remained, not as CTO, but as guardian of stewardship. Her job now, to listen as much as to lead. The final Echo protocol, dubbed Horizon, was launched quietly. It didn't collect data. It didn't archive. It only asked one question: what memory do you want to become? And across the world, answers began to ripple back. Some wrote poems. Others hummed lullabies. A few simply whispered names. And somewhere in all that noise, in all that human, raw, beautiful noise, was the future already listening.